lower-ranking officials that charged forward to apprehend him couldn't block Chuan Yizhen's fists at and all perished on the spot. Seeing the situation growing severe, Feng Xin, Pei Su, and Lang Chenchou all leapt over to surround Chuan Yizhen, ready to attack. Yin Yu cried, "Ignore him. Don't touch him. He won't kill anymore." As long as they didn't prevent Chuan Yizhen from completing his command, he wouldn't cause harm. However, Chuan Yizhen had already killed over 10 martial heavenly officials, so who would continue to let him run free? Of course, no one would believe in Yin Yu's words. If it was someone with fast reactions who could remain calm in the midst of chaos, they would have instantly shouted, "Drop to the ground, surrender and don't move," or a command to that effect. But things were happening too fast, and there was no time to react. Yin Yu had never experienced any situation like this. Plus, he was already in distress. His ability to make decisions was completely out of sorts, making one mistake after the other, one wrong step, and the rest of his steps in shambles. Just as Yin Yu was running around with his head cut off, Mu Qing suddenly appeared behind him, trying to get away. Only then did Yin Yu realize he was also fleeing without direction, and he instantly braked, trying to explain himself. "I wasn't..." But Mu Qing didn't wait for him to speak before twisting his arm behind his back. Shilin heard a crisp crack, Yin Yu's face twisting. As a martial god, to be subdued by another martial god whose ability and strength were greater was a double whammy to both the body and mind. As for Pei Ming, who was only watching the fight from the side without participating, he commented from a distance, "How come it's like his strength suddenly exploded?" He was of course referring to Chuan Yizhen. Chuan Yizhen was already capable in combat, but with the Brigade Immortal on him, the level increased twofold. When other martial gods faced him one-on-one, it was actually 2 against 1, and it wasn't fair. But since no one knew the secret within, they were too embarrassed to attack him jointly, because wouldn't it be pathetic otherwise? As they fought, Chuan Yizhen ran down the main street of the Heavenly Court, covered head to toe in blood. When he suddenly saw a palace on the road, he dashed right in, head first. The crowd shouted, "He's entered the palace of Yin Yu." The command Yin Yu gave him was to leave, but he didn't say to where, so Chuan Yizhen went randomly. Several martial guards also followed him in. Since everyone else was clear of mind, they held back while fighting Chuan Yizhen, but he didn't care for anyone and fought with all he was worth against anyone who would obstruct his orders. Thus, this enraged the other martial gods. Feng Xin shouted, "This brat reeks of evil. Let's beat him down first and talk later." Everyone had that very intention, and the moment Feng Xin shouted, no one stayed reserved any longer. They all rushed in, surrounding him to beat him to a pulp. Swords swung, palms blasted, fists flew, legs kicked. Half of that already deteriorating palace of Yin Yu instantly collapsed. When Yin Yu, who was still being restrained by Mu Qing, saw with his own eyes his palace falling apart from the brawl, his eyes bulged and he yelled, "Please stop fighting." As if that would stop the martial gods, but Chuan Yizhen heard his order and suddenly arrested his fists. Now he'd done it. All the swords, blasts, fists, and kicks landed heavily on Chuan Yizhen. Another tragedy. Lang Chenchou didn't have the time to hold back his longsword and struck it deep into Chuan Yizhen's shoulder. Thank goodness his sword was dull, and he instantly stopped his attack, so Chuan Yizhen wasn't sliced in two. Lan Chencho shouted, "Stop fighting. It looks like you can't move anymore." Fengxin wiped the blood off his face. Finally. Chuan Yizhen lay on the ground stiffly, like he was bound by rope. On the side, Mu Qing tied Yin Yu's wrists with a mortal binding rope before letting go of him. Yin Yu fell to the ground in a daze, and he looked dumbfoundedly at the mess that was his palace of Yin Yu. Scanning around, his eyes moved back to Chuan Yizhen, who dropped to the floor before him. Chuan Yizhen seemed to really have a strong life force. Even after being beaten to a pulp by several martial guards just now, his body practically contorted. He didn't lie still for very long before he suddenly sat up again straight, confused. "What's going on?" he asked. The martial guards were all going to go mad from rage. They all shouted at the same time, "You're in big trouble now." Ling Wen had been following and watching closely behind, and she finally exhaled, her face pale. She somehow still managed to coordinate help as she raised two pressed fingers to her temple and cried out in the spiritual communication array, "Medical officials, emergency aid, now." Chuan Yizhen was still very confused. He looked back and saw Yin Yu sitting on the ground, so he crawled to stand up, seeming to want to help him up. Seeing that completely oblivious face matched with the background of his smashed divine palace, Yin Yu was still silent, but his face was slowly contorting. Chuan Yizhen didn't know what had transpired at all and asked, "Shisho, what are you doing?" It was like Yin Yu suddenly lost all sanity. He puffed an abrupt laugh, then shouted with his eyes brimming red, "Go die." Hearing that cry, Shilian, along with the many heavenly officials present, all widened their eyes instantly. Having received the order, Chuan Yizhen immediately took action without thinking. He grabbed a sword from the ground, and with the sword in one hand and the other pulling up his hair, he aimed for his own throat. The moment he moved, the first assumption of the martial gods was that he was going to sneak attack, so they jumped back multiple feet away. Yet they had never expected that he was actually going to slit his own throat. And by then, it was too late for them to snatch his sword, so they all roared at him. Yin Yu was also astounded, but he still hadn't yet come to and turned away. Blood was about to splatter when Jinwu's figure suddenly flashed behind Chuan Yizhen. Crack, 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 crack. Within an instant, all four of Chuan Yizhen's limbs were dislodged. Then, Jinwu chopped precisely on the back of Chuan Yizhen's neck. Chuan Yizhen lost consciousness completely, falling back to the ground in a heap. His body no longer resembled that of a human. His blood puddled around him. Finally, everyone, including Shilian, sighed a breath of relief. Everyone except Junwu. He turned around. His expression showed neither rage nor joy, but was nonetheless exceedingly grim. He turned to Yin Yu. "With things having progressed thus, I trust you have an explanation." Yin Yu had his head buried deeply in his hands, and only when he heard him did he look up. "I don't know anything. I'm not involved. It's not me. It's..." However, he trailed off as he suddenly snapped out of it, looking like he suddenly realized just what exactly had come out of his mouth. Under so many eyes, he told Chuan Yizhen to go die, and Chuan Yizhen had heeded. It was impossible for anyone not to have drawn the obvious conclusion. Mu Qing spoke up. "My lord, Qi Ying's reaction just now must have been born from some wicked spell cast upon him. There must be something on him that makes him follow Yin Yu's commands. But what, we don't know. Naturally, Ling Wen, who was standing on the side, knew exactly what that something was, but she didn't dare speak a word. Just coordinating helping hands on the scene was as much as she could do. Long Chen Cho said in disbelief, "There's such a thing in this world." Just then, someone pushed aside the crowd to rush in, and it was Jian Yu. It was obvious that he had been out chasing after and looking for Yin Yu before coming back, and hadn't yet been told of what had happened. "What are you all doing?" he asked. What's happened to our palace of Yin Yu? How did it become like this? Who smashed it?" Jin Wu approached Yin Yu languidly. "He heeded your orders. How are you controlling him?" His voice wasn't harsh, but there was the oppressive air of power, exceedingly suffocating. To be looked down upon from high above, it added another layer of fear in one's heart. It wasn't like Shilian had never committed major mistakes, but he had never seen Jin Wu like this before. It seemed Jin Wu had really let him off easy. Yin Yu's mind was already in disarray, and as far as Shilian could see, his mind wasn't very strong to begin with. His ability to react in situations was weak. At a time like this, he couldn't utter a single word. Seeing that he wasn't responding, Jin Wu said, "Just as well, even if you won't speak, I already know. It's that armor." He was done for. Finished. Everything was doomed. Yin Yu crouched on the ground, hugging his head anew as waves of talk started from all around him. "Astonishing. I have never witnessed anything more inconceivable in the heavens. A heavenly official manipulating another heavenly official to have him kill without reservations. He had him murder over 10 officials, and then he'd tell him to go die? What a vile heart." Among the crowds, when Jian Yu figured out such a major incident had happened, his face also blanched. Still he gritted his teeth and charged out, kneeling on the ground. "My lord, that armor it was me who gave it to Chuan Yizhen. It had nothing to do with Yin Yu." Only then did Yin Yu seem to stir, and he croaked, "Jian Yu." Jian Yu braced himself and cried loudly, "I had only wanted to teach that brat a lesson, but I hadn't thought it would cause such a major incident." On the side, Chuan Yizhen was still unconscious, lying in a pool of his own blood. The medicine masters and heavenly officials had rushed to the scene surrounding him. Jian Yu said, "I've always hated that brat, but Yin Yu has always treated him with courtesy. Many here can stand witness to this. He didn't know anything about the armor." However, at this point, it was too late. There was no one who would believe that Yin Yu wasn't involved at all anymore. Instantly, someone piped up, "You're only a low-ranking official in the palace of Yin Yu, yet you already hate him to the point of causing him harm. It's easy to imagine that the master heavenly official you serve wouldn't be any better." There were even taunts. He didn't know anything. If he didn't know anything, why would he tell him to go die? Don't tell me he's only joking. If it was said that Yin Yu's reactions were all reasonable, that he only lost himself from distress, then his last words of "go die" negated everything. Those words could not break him free of condemnation. Thinking back, when Ling Wen first told Shilian the story, she said that Yin Yu was playing a prank, which Shilian could now appreciate as her trying to help Yin Yu cover up a little. Jian Yu couldn't believe it. "What? Stop talking nonsense. How could Yin say anything of the sort? He's always been polite and courteous with this brat. Why would he tell him to go die? Yin, you didn't say it, right? You didn't say something like that. You wouldn't have said it. However, Yin didn't answer him, and instead closed his eyes. Yin just wouldn't accept it, and everyone around had become speechless. We all heard it with our own ears. How can it be denied? Yin quickly said, "There must have been a misunderstanding. There's so much you all don't know." No matter the kind of misunderstanding, whether we know or not, there's no misunderstanding great enough for one to want to kill one's own Shadi. Hearing this, Yin and Zhen were both silenced. That heavenly official continued. "I heard that ever since Chuan Yijin went independent and erected his own palace, the people of the palace of Yin stopped caring for him. Every time Chuan Yijin visited, the excuse was always no one was around. I was confused at first, so it turns out it was because they couldn't stand him. Speaking of, didn't someone mistake him for the wrong person at the Mid-Autumn banquet the other day? I saw how dark their faces got at the time. Those were all undeniable truths, but the conclusion was wrong. Oh, I know of that incident too. It was pretty awkward, but it's still not bad enough to want to harm someone. Yeah, it's a little too small-minded." Jianyu's eyes were seeing red, and he shouted, "I already said His Highness had nothing to do with this. I'm the one who committed the crime. I admit to everything. Is that not enough?" Yet, even if Yin was to jump into the Yellow River, he wouldn't be able to wash himself clean. In the eyes of others, this was only enough to prove that Yin had a malicious but loyal subordinate. Besides, only 2 words were enough to shut down all arguments. Well, "Go die" didn't come out of anyone else's mouth. Things were becoming more and more heated. Junwu said darkly, "Take them all down. Lingwen, stay here and watch over Qiying." Lingwen inclined her head to acknowledge the command, and Junwu stalked out of the palace of Yin. Several martial heavenly officials pulled Yin to his feet, and Yin was heart-stricken. "Let it go, Jinyu. Don't say any more." Jinyu was also pulled up and bound with an immortal binding rope. He cried, "It's always let it go, let it go. This time, you mustn't let it go. Let it go, and you'll be finished. You'll be banished. You'll be banished for sure." However, Yin only sighed. "Let it go. If it's banishment, then so be it. Even if I stay here, there's no meaning to it." Yin cried bitterly. You should never ever have said those words. Just those 2 words, and you lost all hope of turning this around. You'd usually never curse him to go die. So why, of all times, did you have to say it now? Those words. It was like Yin suddenly aged 10 years, and his eyes had lost their light. He himself seemed to be a little lost, and he shook his head. "I don't know why either. I don't want to argue anymore." He sighed and stumbled a couple of steps as he was being taken away. Then Jinyu suddenly cried out, "Why?" Everyone turned to look at him. Jinyu cried, "It's not like you didn't work as hard. You're stronger than him by 10,000-fold, better than him by 1,000,000-fold. Chuan Yijin is nothing, so what if I hate him? Why is it that he's like that and you're like this? Why isn't it him who's banished?" He grit his teeth in resentment, so filled with hate for the reality of things, so filled with hate that tears rolled down his cheeks. But there were many things in this world where just hard work wasn't enough. Perhaps he knew this in his heart, but he just couldn't accept it, unable at all to swallow this resentment. Listening to his cries, Yanni's steps became too heavy for him to move. He buried his face in his hands and fell to the ground in a heap before the palace of Yanni. He roared, "Enough! I already said to not say any more. Please, just let me go." He covered his ears and cried until he was hoarse. "Please, stop repeatedly reminding me. Stop talking. I beg you all to stop talking." Shilin couldn't bear to watch any longer. That's enough. Thus, Huacheng dispersed the scene, and the two lightly separated their foreheads. After having touched foreheads for so long, Shilin felt it to be a bit numb and even a bit itchy, his front uncomfortably warm. He wanted to raise his hand to rub at it, but his limbs couldn't move. Huacheng seemed to have detected his little discomfort and raised his hand to help him rub, like it was the most natural thing to do in the world, before dropping his hand. Outside, by the stone wall, the ghost mask-wearing Yanni had been pacing back and forth, and after a while, he turned to Chuan Yijin. He said coldly, "You want to come out?" He intentionally changed his voice. Chuan Yijin nodded. "I do." Yanni replied, "Very well, look here." Then in the blink of an eye, with flashing speed, the shovel was whacked against Chuan Yijin's head. There was a loud clunk, and Chuan Yijin instantly dropped silent. Shilin was stunned. "No way, he whacked him dead? He really killed him?" Huacheng laughed heartily. "Don't worry, Gogo. He's not dead. He just fainted." After the shovel was swung, Yanni exhaled a breath. In the end, he seemed to have decided to dig Chuan Yijin out of the wall after all. He raised the Earthmaster shovel, digging through the wall, bit by bit. Shilin understood. If Yanni was to save Chuan Yijin directly, Yanni wouldn't be able to fight him and win, and he risked exposing his identity, which would be distressing. The relationship between the two, Shishong and Shidi, truly was distressing to the extreme, and who was more distressed couldn't be compared. It was probably for the best that Yanni pretended not to know him. "Sunlang, should we maybe also think of a way to get out of here now?" Shilin said. Huacheng seemed to be enjoying himself where they were. Already? Shilin didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Well, yeah. You want to live in here?" "If it's with Gogo, I don't see why not," Huacheng said. "All right, fine. I was joking." He schooled his expression and reached out to cover Shilin's ears. "What's this?" Shilin asked. Huacheng smiled. "I'm too lazy to walk out, so I might as well blow the whole place up." Shilin was just thinking whether they would blow up others who were also swallowed by the mountain spirit, when his expression suddenly changed. "Wait." Huacheng bore the same expression and dropped his hands. The two listened intently. A moment later, Shilin whispered, "Did you hear that?" Huacheng also lowered his voice. "I did." Yanni was on the other side of the stone wall, digging holes with the Earthmaster shovel, and on the other side of the stone wall, there was someone else who was talking. There weren't any silver butterflies spying. They heard the voices directly themselves, because that person was standing really, really close to the stone wall, almost pressing against it and speaking. Shilin held his breath to listen, but could only hear muffled, intermittent, indistinct words like "ate them," "upper court," and "martial guards." His mind whizzed, and he exchanged a look with Huacheng, then tried with difficulty to move closer toward the voice. That voice belonged to a man, and he seemed to be conversing with someone, because every time he said something, he would pause for a moment. Yet, Shilin didn't hear any sounds from the one he was conversing with. Maybe it was because the other was further away. Once they shuffled over silently, that voice became somewhat clearer. Although the words were still somewhat blurred here and there, Shilin at least heard fuller sentences. That man said, "His Highness the Crown Prince has also come. I don't want to take this step. I'm sure you're the same, but he's beyond saving." Shilin wondered inwardly. Me? How am I beyond saving? Wait, this voice. This voice was very familiar. He must have heard it before, and had heard it for a long, long time, not just once or twice. But since it was a long, long time ago, he couldn't instantly match the voice to the man. Just as he was thinking really hard, that man added, "Then let him end here." Suddenly, Shilin remembered who this voice belonged to. He twitched his lips and muttered without a sound, "Guan." The person on the other side of the stone wall had the exact same voice as the esteemed master who once taught him in the kingdom of Shenla.